Anyway, today we're getting started on Module 2, and the theme is Zombies, Dehumanization, and Biopower. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's up with zombies. Why are we interested in them? All right, so where we're going to go in this module is, first of all, allowing me to click to the next thing. We'll talk just a little bit about some terms from the reading from last week from Apocalyptic Transformations, but then we'll also get into talking about zombies. Okay. Oh, and one last thing too, upcoming assignment. One of the next readings is a little different than the rest of them this semester because you have some options. You can either read the book of Revelation, or you can pick a text from any other religion or culture that is a story of the end times. And so, and then in the discussion, we'll do some comparing and contrasting of these different stories. And, this kind of connects to some of the reading points from Apocalyptic Transformations in that different cultures have different stories about how the world ends and also, of course, how the world has come to be. And some of them, there are more linear narratives where there's a beginning of the world and then here we all are, and then it ends and something then transforms into something different. But other cultures have stories where an apocalypse is sort of part of a cycle, right? Where the earth is kind of, or life and the world is sort of comes to be, has a cycle, is destroyed, and then is reborn, and then comes to be, and is reborn, and is more of a cyclical sort of a circular process. And this also connects to this idea of New Jerusalem that we saw in the reading, right? Where in some traditions, the world ends and then something better comes about. Whereas in some places, it's just a repeating of what has already been. And of course, in others, it's just, that's it. All right. And so it'll be interesting to see what folks come up with in the discussions and, how they compare those. Another important point from the reading that we'll definitely be getting into today, because it correlates directly into the kind of the lore around zombies, is the idea that apocalypse is a social criticism, right? Somebody isn't acting right. We are out of balance with nature. We are not acting according to the will of a god, whatever it might be. Something is usually kind of bringing forth the apocalypse. And this is really important because what it means is, let me see here, is that it also means that some people are essentially kind of craving the apocalypse, right? Or they are believing that an apocalypse is sort of a judgment and a just judgment that is coming because people are not acting correctly. And for those of you who end up reading Revelation, for next week, you'll see that the first part of Revelation is really all these letters that are kind of, to these churches in Asia Minor, which is essentially where Turkey is now. And that is sort of a story about, how the writer, John the Revealer, is basically saying, people in these different churches are not acting correctly. And then the second part of Revelation is like, well, and this is sort of the fiery doom that awaits people that are not acting kind of according to kind of God's will. And so there's a long history of that in terms of how that story then gets translated into more modern stories as well. But it's and also in zombie lore that we're going to get into today. Other points from the reading that I think are important to point out real quick. One is the idea that the desire for apocalypse is essentially a desire for certainty, even if that certainty is sort of bad. It's this idea that the world is somewhat out of control, that it needs to be simplified, that, so it's not just that the world is bad or out of whack, but also that it's just complicated. And the apocalypse is a very simplifying event. But another key point that we should keep in our heads when we're talking about these different apocalyptic stories is that oftentimes in the stories, especially ones that have a New Jerusalem, right, where kind of the believers or the chosen people or, the people that are acting correctly kind of then get to inherit the earth. What happens if you're not in that group? What if you're not one of the chosen people, right? In other words, we kind of have to think about it not just from the perspective of the people imagining the story, but what does that story mean for other people that aren't kind of imagined to be kind of the righteous that deserve to go on to the next level here. If you're someone else's version of wicked or heretical or dangerous or whatever, you have to recognize that the desire for apocalypse is often a genocidal urge, right? It's about, quote, simplifying the world, cleansing the world, and getting rid of all the things that people don't like. And guess guess what that might mean? That might mean you going somewhere else. And so we have to think about kind of the function that kind of desires for apocalypse play in modern society and in lots of different cultures. This is not something that you just see in Western traditions. You see it in others as well, where the apocalypse comes and kind of wipes away the enemies, leaving the earth, kind of for the chosen. Okay. So now let's launch more directly into thinking about zombies and what's up with our culture's fascination with zombies. And of course, part of this is that we need to talk about why in a course called Apocalypse, Science and Society. Yeah, believe it or not, I know the name of my own class. Forgot it there for a second. But anyway, clearly zombies are fictional, so why are we talking about them? Well, because they actually serve some very important social, cultural functions. There's a reason why we're very fascinated with zombies and why these stories have become so popular to the point where there's a zillion different books, TV shows, movies, etc., with zombies in them. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the functions that they serve and kind of how we can read about some very real kind of politics and social processes from understanding this fictional process, these fictional creatures. So first of all, just kind of a brief history of zombies here. Zombie kind of comes from a Haitian Creole word, and originally the idea of what constituted a zombie was somebody who was originally alive but under a spell. So these days we usually think of zombies as the dead, kind of somehow not fully, underground and staying still, right? The moving dead. But originally, the meaning of zombie was quite different. It was a person who was alive, but under a spell or a potion that makes them lack free will, that they were suggestible and controllable, that somebody could put somebody into essentially a zombie state and then have them do what they want them to do. This changed a little bit as you get into the 1960s, movies like Night of the Living Dead, and then Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead, and the ones that came after that, where you start having, where it becomes really like the dead walking the earth. That can only be killed in certain ways. I think kind of cinematically, it was an excuse to be able to have a video or a movie where people are just shooting people in the head all the time in a way that's really violent. But by making the things that you are shooting zombies not quite really alive, it sort of made it more okay than if you were making a movie about shooting real people in the head. And then you get these different variations of zombies, right? 28 Days Later, which we'll watch here for this class, the zombies actually move pretty fast. World War Z, they go even faster. But then in Walking Dead, they're different, they're slow. In some movies, they can't go out into the daylight, and some they can. And there's all these different variations, just like there are with stories like vampires and other kind of mythical creatures. But there's this question, because when zombies are really slow moving, there's this idea of how on earth do such slow-moving things become a plague or a threat that kind of expands? Because that's usually my critique when I watch some videos with like slow-moving zombies. It's like, wouldn't everyone have killed these at some point, like a long time ago, because you can outrun them at a slow jog? But anyway, the idea of zombies, though, typically is this idea of this constantly escalating population while people are a declining one. In other words, it's this slow threat that kind of starts. By the time you kind of notice that it's around, it's sort of enveloping you and kind of overtaking you almost like a rising sea. Right? But it's important to think, too, here about the idea that zombies as a genre, that zombies are a stand-in for other dangers, and zombie apocalypses are models for other kinds of disasters that are actually real. So zombies are, in a sense, the creation of the threat we cannot control, right? And what this thing is that we fear, that we cannot control, shifts over time. And some of the very early movies and stories about zombies was actually very much sort of a racist fear that there was others that had magic and were going to be able to control people. And some of the early ones, there's a movie White Zombie way back in the day with Bela Lugosi, who also played Dracula. And this idea that he could kind of put white women under his spell with the zombie grip. And this was, again, this kind of early version of a zombie where the people that have been made into zombies are not dead. They're just they're alive, but under the control of this person. And so that was sort of attached to this sort of fear of sort of like the powers and magic of sort of, quote, the others. Right? But later you get zombies created by other things that we fear. So for instance, radiation in the 1960s became a very big sort of way in which zombies came to be, right? Radiation or military and government projects that were secret, contamination in general, kind of being the thing that created the zombies. Later, it becomes things like pathogens and viruses. And a lot of this starts coming up really in the age of HIV in the 1980s and into the 90s. And into today, most zombie movies, it's the idea of some sort of contagion that creates it. But this has shifted over time based on what it is that kind of we have a lot of social fear around. And this is actually a quote by Max Brooke, who wrote World War Z and other things. He says, and this quote here I think is worth really looking at. It says, "Zombies are the perfect tool for exploring apocalyptic fears. There are things that are really scary out there in this world that are a lot scarier than zombies, but we don't talk about them. A discussion about the AIDS pandemic could clear a party, but if you talk about zombies, you've got the room." Right? And so in other words, it's a stand-in. Instead of whatever this other thing is that you really fear, you can talk about this in a fictional way. And here, another quote, "Zombie fiction and movies, when they're good, aren't about zombies. They're stories about people and how they respond." Right? So a zombie is a stand-in for anything we fear. A pandemic, racism, societal change, depersonalization of humanity, a pervasive threat, and how this threat affects people. It's the core of drama and a never-ending blank canvas. And of course, this has a lot to do with also science fiction movies like around aliens and things like that. Like, what would happen if aliens encountered us? And what would it be like to sort of be on the, as sort of a, to be in the position of kind of facing that threat. And it's, of course, a lot of science fiction is really an allegory for colonialism, right? Where a more powerful entity comes in and kind of try to destroy you. Yeah. That said, there are three main functions of apocalyptic literature and movies. And one of them is this idea of collective therapy. Apocalyptic literature helps us conquer fear. And when we're no longer afraid, we can do. And one of the reasons it helps us kind of conquer fear is it makes us, in a sense, kind of face a fake one and think about how we might react in that, and which leads to the second point, which is that it's essentially a worst case strategic analysis. How do you kind of access something unthinkable? The real struggle in the story is not about defeating the zombies. It's the struggle to adapt, to see reality as it really is, and how would you then kind of make it through this worst case scenario, right? What would happen if all of society sort of totally evaporated and there was threats all around and you just kind of had to find a way to survive? It's a way of sort of thinking through those strategies. And then lastly, there's this idea that apocalyptic stories are a window into the soul, that it shows who we, quote, really are if we're stripped of our social niceties. And on a social level, about how a corrupted nation or world can redeem its humanity. So in other words, in a lot of these zombie stories, right, and I'll get into this a little more, it's this idea of kind of the small band of people or individuals, without kind of the help of the normal social institutions. How do you then kind of respond? How do you make it through and kind of show that you're still moral? Okay. But one of the things that's very interesting about zombie literature and movies is that the messages that are sent are actually about how you would react in a worst case scenario, and all this actually cement some ideas that most social scientists kind of really doubt or question. In other words, you're getting some bad messages in terms of how you're supposed to react in a pressure or catastrophic situation. Because when we think about it, what is almost always the correct response to a zombie attack in movies, TVs, literature? Violence. Right? That's what gets you through. Now, part of this, of course, is just about making good TV or good literature because it's, conflict, kind of drives the narrative and keeps people interested. Oh, there's violence getting closer. Okay. But in these zombie stories, typically there's this idea that in a state of sort of social disintegration, that the proper response is violence, right? First of all, violence towards whatever you're referring to as the zombies, which are essentially the dehumanized masses, sort of the already dead. And there's a term called homo sacer, which I'll explain in this lecture a little bit here, a few minutes down the road. But essentially it means sacrificial life. It's people who are, they're alive, but you don't really consider them people. In other words, it's not just sort of, quote, the enemy, it's sort of like the disposable people that don't matter to you. And typically this term is also about people that don't matter to the government, right? That have no rights, that have no legal protections. And we'll talk a little more about this, but the idea that zombies sort of stand in for what we call homo sacer. It's a target at which justifiable violence can be directed. There's no issue of morality around what to do. But the other thing in a lot of zombie narratives is that it's also about kind of thinking through the morality of violence towards other humans during a zombie apocalypse. There's moral fretting about whether you should be violent towards other people, but violence is still viewed largely as what makes you capable of surviving and worthy of surviving. For those of you who watch The Walking Dead, that is basically the theme of the whole show, kind of over and over again to a large extent. All right, so to kind of explain this a little bit, I'm going to get into a couple social theory terms, and then we're going to have a debate between Michel Foucault and Negan from The Walking Dead. We'll see how that goes. Okay. All right. So when we think about this idea of violence in a state of catastrophe, there's this interesting mix of how, you're not just supposed to be violent to everybody. I mean, most of these stories, there's the idea that the lone wolf typically doesn't make it very well. Like, you need somebody around you. You have to have affinity, right? You have to have relationships of connection to some people around you while also being violent to others. So you need a coalition, and then there are others that you need to be held at arm's length. And the question is often, who do you hold solidarity with? Who do you not? And so affinity for some, ruthless violence for others. And again, central tension in Walking Dead and other stories too. And I think one of the things that these shows are trying to get at is, in a crisis, with whom do you hold solidarity? Is it your family? Is it your neighborhood? Is it your nationality? And guess what? This is coming up right now in the coronavirus pandemic, right? Who do you hold solidarity to? Yourself, your family, your community? Do you wear a mask? Do you not wear a mask? Do you travel? Do you not travel? Who is it that you feel that you are responsible for in terms of their health? And this obviously is a very political question that has created a lot of tension and conflict here in the United States. But also, what kind of governance structure is survivable? By post-apocalyptic stories, right, there are some where you might have a collaborative kind of group. You might have kind of a dictatorship with a strong leader. Is it treating everybody fairly around you? Is it exploiting people? What makes you survivable? And most movies and shows tend to think that a small, tight band with suspicion and violence towards others is what gets you through, right? Sort of a tribal type of mentality. But what's interesting is that we need to think about whether that's really true, right? One of the theorists that comes to mind here is Peter Kropotkin, who is considered to be kind of one of the founders of the discipline of geography and environmental studies as well. And he wrote a book called Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution. He wrote many other books too, but one of the things that he talks about and emphasizes, and Peter Kropotkin's from like the 1800s, right? So kind of a historical character, not around today. But when people were talking a lot about survival of the fittest, right? Kind of the Darwinian idea of kind of who survives in nature. A lot of people in the stream of what's called social Darwinism sort of took this idea that it meant the strongest survive. In other words, if you were the biggest, baddest, individual around, then you're the one that's going to survive and the other people aren't, right? And that's just kind of nature is tough and that's just how it is. Kropotkin kind of questioned this and said, what actually makes you more fit is cooperation and altruism. And so what he says here is, in the long run, the practice of solidarity proves much more advantageous to the species than the development of individuals endowed with predatory inclinations. And so, in other words, if you bind together and have a larger collective around you, and you can also take advantage of being more productive and sharing and all this stuff, that actually makes you be able to survive better. And I think an important point here is that when we talk about survival of the fittest, fit does not necessarily mean strongest. Fit is like, are you fit in the particular context that you are in? And I'm going to tell kind of two quick stories. One is the story of Stormy Steve. Now, when I was growing up as a kid in Phoenix, we had Nazi skinheads around because it was Phoenix, it was the 80s, and we just had Nazis around. Probably still do. But anyway, there was one guy named Stormy Steve. And he was in my middle school, and he was a lot older than the other kids in the middle school, and he was violent, and he was a badass, and he was huge. And I was absolutely terrified of this guy, right? I was really skinny. I wasn't really into fighting a whole lot. And for some reason, he took a dislike to me as well as many other people. And so I tried to avoid Stormy Steve. Now, if you look at both of us at this time period, and also later through high school and stuff, he was around. You would easily say, well, he's definitely way stronger than me. He's bigger than me. He's more violent than me. He is definitely sort of, if it came down to me and him on an island, who's the fittest, right? Well, he'd be able to kick my ass. One great story about Stormy Steve is that he actually ended up going to prison because he walked into a 7-Eleven, grabbed 2 cases of beer, and I think he was like 16 or something, grabbed 2 cases of beer, beat the hell out of the clerk, beat up some of the cops on his way out, escaped, and then a couple days later they ended up finding him, put him in jail, and he was there first at juvie, and then he got out, then anyway, he went back into prison. I don't know what happened to him, might have died in prison. Anyway, we'll use that for the story. Let's just say he died in prison, because that's not a bad ending for Stormy Steve. All right, so here's the thing. So now, here I am, I have a job, I have kids, and let's say, hypothetically, he died in prison. Who was actually the more fit person? He's stronger than I am. He'd totally kick my ass. And if we were in a tropical island and fighting over, like, the last piece of boar meat, yeah, he'd probably win. But in the context of our actual society, who was more fit? Me, because I wasn't running into 7-Elevens and beating up the clerk with a 12 case of beer. So, in other words, fitness has to do with your context, and sometimes being altruistic, having friends, not being a violent jerk, actually makes you kind of more survivable. And the other way we can think about fitness is if we think about the current pandemic and the way certain government institutions or economies are function. An economy that works really, really well when there isn't a pandemic may not necessarily be a very fit economy when there is a pandemic, right? Because it doesn't necessarily work in that particular context. Government policies that don't work during a pandemic might have worked very well when there wasn't a pandemic, right? But when the context shifts, the fitness of even social institutions and policies comes into question. And that's one of the key things too. Like, for instance, one of the things that we're seeing today is that there are some societies that may not have been as efficient when there wasn't a pandemic, but because of the way in which their governments and societies are kind of arranged, they may be more fit for this particular context. And so the idea that fitness is sort of context dependent. Okay. So the next idea that I want to get into is this idea of biopower, and then we're going to loop it back around to zombies here in a minute. Okay. And this is a very key point, and it connects to that idea of altruism, which is that people are not just consumers, they're not just competition for resources, they also make stuff, right? We produce things, resources, economies, cultures, institutions. In other words, if we think of humans as just sort of a plague of locusts that are coming and eating all the stuff that we would rather eat, then it's really easy to sort of think of them like zombies, right? They're just this mass of humanity that's washing over the earth and taking all the stuff, right? If, however, we recognize that humans actually produce things, right? Like if you look around my office or the place that you're sitting now, this thing, these chopsticks, this apple, humans were involved in making these things, right? The reason I have an apple in my office right now is because somebody else produced it. So humans don't just eat everything, they also make stuff, right, and distribute it. And so this is a key point. And where this idea comes from is from a lot of the political philosophies of a guy named Michel Foucault. He actually died in the 80s. And he had this kind of perspective where he looked at Europe at the end of the European Wars of Expansion in 1648. There was this thing called the Treaty of Westphalia. And this was a time period when a lot of the different actors in Europe really started solidifying into what we would consider countries today, right? Prior to this, it was a little sort of Game of Thrones, right? Where everybody's like different families are trying to take over the whole place. Different people are claiming to be kind of in charge of the whole area. At the Treaty of Westphalia, you get these agreements that this idea that we're going to divide up into countries. And there's going to be a French monarch, and they're going to handle France. And you're going to have an Italian monarch. Well, Italy's a bad example because they were pretty fractured. Spain. Spain is going to be ruled by a Spanish monarch. And we're going to split up the territory and kind of officially mind our own businesses within these territories. And so this was very different in terms of then how you tried to govern the population in France or in Spain or in England. Because now you're not so much trying to take over all of Europe, but you are trying to compete with other countries to make sure that you're just as strong as they are. And so there becomes this very big shift in terms of what government power is all about. And this gets this idea of biopower. And this is just a map of kind of what Europe looked like at the Treaty of Westphalia, where you have France and Spain, and of course you have England over here, and you have the Swedish possessions and all of that. But at this time, there's this big shift in what power is all about, from protecting kind of the king or queen and kind of expanding the realm, to trying to compete with your rivals by making sure that your population is productive, right? Because the way you compete with rivals is you capture the productivity of living beings. And what I mean by competing with rivals, you need an army, so you need soldiers. You need to feed them. You need to feed your workers. You need to be able to figure out what resources you have in your realm, whether it's timber or coal or mineral resources for your industries. So governments all of a sudden become very, very interested in what their population's doing. And some of the things that they do would be considered what we might consider very nice things or good things. Hold on. Okay, here. There's this idea that a monarch of a country can't just do whatever they want. They have to make their population productive, or they're not going to be a country anymore. Somebody else will invade or take over, or the people will rebel or something. And so you get this idea that there's this sort of larger economy that they have to sort of respond to, and that states then start becoming very, very interested, and by state I mean government here, become very interested in public health, right? Because if you want to capture the productivity of your population, it's better if they're healthy. You also want to educate them, so you're going to build schools, and again, you're going to have hospitals. You're going to have asylums for people with mental health issues, but you're also going to be doing discipline. You're going to have police that are making sure people aren't stealing from each other, making sure that people are showing up at work, making sure people are paying their taxes. And then you also get statistics, which is the government becomes very, very interested in collecting the information so it can understand everything that's going on in its realm, right? And in order to govern, it's not just trying to keep the population in its place. It needs them productive, and it needs to know what they're doing. And this is the idea of biopower, the idea that the power of the country comes from having productive people and being able to get that productivity from them, right? But there's also a dark side to this idea when we talk about biopower, and then also biopolitics, which is sort of a technique of how you manage these populations, which is also sometimes referred to as necropolitics, necro meaning death, right? Which is this idea that also to make a very productive kind of society, that there are oftentimes groups within your society that you are labeling as sort of the out group, as people who don't matter. And this is idea that you have to protect sort of the social body of, quote, the people that matter from these others. Now, these others could be, quote, people from foreign places, but they could also be somebody who lives within the population who is singled out, essentially scapegoated as being a threat to the larger population. So in, for instance, Nazism in Germany, this was very obvious. They looked at people who were Jewish, communists, LGBTQ folks, and said, these are kind of the enemy within, and we are going to, persecute them and kill them, because there's this idea that they were kind of going to, in a sense, sort of infect the larger country that, quote, mattered. We still have this today, right? If you look at the rhetoric around, say, terrorists or people that are migrants or these sort of things, there's the same kind of logic that these people are coming in and they're kind of hurting the larger health and productivity of the nation. And so then some group of people is then singled out as the people who are, as mentioned here, homo sacer, sacrificial life. They who can be killed, but it doesn't necessarily qualify as murder, right? Because they're not considered to be full political subjects. And this cycles us back around here to zombies. And the idea that zombies sort of take this place of kind of the homo sacer, right? The people that are considered to be a threat, the people who are not us. And by us, I mean kind of a narrowly defined kind of national group. And so, so when we talk about this idea of biopower, going to take a quick break from me talking and have a little debate between Michel Foucault and Negan from The Walking Dead in terms of their versions of how they view biopower.
Voir dans un système politique comme ceux qu'on a connus au Moyen-Âge, ces pouvoirs, entendus au sens donc de gouvernement des uns par les autres, étaient finalement assez lâches. Le problème, c'était de prélever, de faire le prélèvement fiscal qui était nécessaire, qui était utile ou qu'on voulait. Bon, ce que les gens faisaient dans leur conduite quotidienne n'était pas très important pour l'exercice du pouvoir politique. Il était important sans doute dans le pastorat ecclésiastique. Pour le pouvoir ecclésiastique, le pouvoir politique, il est venu à un moment où ça a été très important. Et où, par exemple, maintenant, pour prendre une chose très simple, le type de consommation des gens devient quelque chose qui est important économiquement, qui est important aussi politiquement. Et c'est vrai que le nombre d'objets qui deviennent objets d'une gouvernementalité réfléchie à l'intérieur de cadres politiques, même libéraux, ce nombre d'objets a considérablement augmenté. Mais je ne pense pas non plus qu'il faille considérer que cette gouvernementalité prenne forcément la forme de l'enfermement, de la surveillance et du contrôle. Par toute une série de régulations subtiles, souvent, on arrive en effet à conduire la conduite des gens, ou à se conduire de telle manière que la conduite des autres ne puisse pas avoir des effets nocifs qu'on redoute, etc.
Okay. So, I mean, thank you, Dr. Foucault. That's a really good point, right? This idea that, power sort of shifted over time, kind of like I was saying before, this idea that, that the techniques of governance are not just about sort of making people not do things, right? It's about sort of influencing them to do things, right? And that may be to keep yourself safe, but as I mentioned, it can also be to sort of encourage them to try to do things so that you can capture that productivity, which is something that Michel Foucault talks about in some of his later work. Now let's see what Negan has to say about this, because I think he has it's kind of similar ideas about capturing the productivity of living beings as sort of a way to sort of survive, right, and to kind of build his empire.
Plan B. People are a resource. Money on the table.
People are the foundation of what we are building here!
Damn, Negan. All right. I get it. I hear what you're saying. First of all, I appreciate your debate style. Points for that. Foucault, sorry. Just not as much oomph in your presentation. So thank you, Negan, for this really informative perspective. So same idea, right? That the way in which you kind of amass power and things is through capturing the productivity of living people, right? People are a resource. The weird thing, of course, is that Negan is a villain, right, in the Walking Dead, particularly in like this season where this comes from. I don't think it's like season 8 or something like that. But his idea is actually, in a sense, much more accurate than it is of Rick and some of the other people in the small bands. Now, I'm not saying that you should, the way Negan goes about doing this in a very dictatorial and violent way. I personally think that it's very unrealistic because I think that somebody would have slit his throat in his sleep a long time ago for acting the way that he does. And so that's one of the things about power is like, yeah, you have to capture the productivity of living beings. But the best way to do that is not to piss them all off or to make them all totally fear you. It's to also sort of want to be part of your team and your process collectively. And so I think that it's misrepresented in many ways in that respect. But it's right that this idea that people are not just threats, they're actually the basis of power. Right? Okay. So just a couple more points here. So how does this apply to an apocalypse or catastrophe? Well, think about it in like the movie Children of Men that we watched, right? And the way refugees are viewed in that movie, in terms of the idea that, again, they're there to sort of, that they're disruptive, that they're not productive or adding to kind of what life is like in Britain during that context. And also in zombie shows, the way other bands of survivors are treated, right? They're not seen as like, hey, if we pool together and do things collectively, we could actually probably be more survivable in total. Instead, there's a lot of suspicion and backstabbing and violence. But another interesting point about biopower when we think about catastrophes and apocalypse is that when there's a major disaster or catastrophe, biological reproduction goes down. The people don't have as many kids, right? It's something that takes a big turn during an apocalypse, which of course makes sense when things are very uncertain. A lot of social systems are breaking down. Is typically not a time that a lot of people have kids. This is something you see in a lot of disaster movies, of course, where there's just, kind of who would bring a baby into this, right? And they sometimes show it, but it's kind of shown as a very unusual thing or something fraught with all sorts of dangers, right? But, and there's actually, like, if you look at like reality and some of the historical precedents for this, this is the birth and death rate of Russia over time from 1900 to 2000. And one of the things that you'll see is, you'll see things like the Civil War and World War I, where their death rate goes through the roof. It's here in red. And also World War II, where their death rate goes up. But the other thing you should notice here is birth rates decline fairly substantially during these difficult times as well. So you can see how they declined during the Civil War, during World War II, and then after the fall of the Soviet Union, they took another dive as well. And so it's not unusual that in a state of total kind of disaster or catastrophe that birth rates also go down. Now, if we take this to kind of its extreme, like from the movie Children of Men, if you don't actually have human reproduction and the development of more people, then that's it for the human race. I mean, that is a catastrophe all on its own. And so if you think of Children of Men, basically the end of childbirth is the end of humanity. It's collectively, right? The entire species is going away. You get about 80 years to think about this happening, and you get to watch it happen very, very slowly. And you see how, in the case of Children of Men, how you see the sort of how the society unravels as humans are no longer able to reproduce, and that people know it's everything that humans are, the whole society is disappearing. And then, of course, that changes over the course of the movie, and this idea of sort of hope, kind of coming in, and what that represents, and also the way that people are kind of fighting amongst themselves to sort of, in a sense, capture that hope for their own ends. But another interesting example of biopower is some from science fiction, like Battlestar Galactica, the more recent one from about 10 years ago or so. Or I guess more like 15 years ago when it began, there's this idea in that, for those of you who haven't watched the show, the humanity essentially is far, far away on other planets, and these, Cylons come and attack them. and there's very few human beings left. And Roslin is the president, essentially, of all of what's left of humanity. And she has this whiteboard in her office, and she's kind of constantly marking down, well, how many humans are left? Because there's this idea that you have to protect kind of what's left, and that every time you can add somebody to that board, it makes everybody, kind of the whole collective, more survivable. Every time you lose people off of that board, the human race becomes more and more precarious in terms of their position. And so there's this idea there of, sort of very much being attuned to the idea of biopower, and this idea that humanity's prospects for the future very much hinge on people surviving rather than a declining population. Okay. Because, of course, no babies equals no people. No people equals not enough biopower, right? Ability to make resources, defend against other threats, etc. So zombie stories can tell us quite a bit about real catastrophes and what we think may happen and how we should act. But there's actually a lot of problems in them sometimes too, because I think they have an over-reliance on emphasizing, violent reactions. And as one of the things we'll see as we go through this semester, that when you actually see disasters, whether they're natural disasters or human-caused disasters, people don't actually typically really start fraying, like society doesn't actually become that violent. You actually see a lot more kind of collective action and what's called mutual aid. And we'll talk about that, particularly at the end of the semester when we read some of Rebecca Solnit's work from the book Paradise Built in Hell, and we'll kind of really kind of get into that. But that's it for this module. Thanks for sticking with it, and I will see you in discussion groups and in the next module.